Welcome to Black Swan's Hardcore Bible. Today's video is going to be on the Danites. We'll call this part 2. So we're going to be continuing our deep dive on the Danites. To do that, we're going to have to go back to the book of Exodus. Now, to be fair, I don't have any notes because the purpose of this video series is to have a conversation with you. Treat this like you and I are sitting across from the coffee table. Maybe we're in a coffee shop somewhere. Maybe we're in the living room. Maybe we're on the drive somewhere. And that's how I'm trying to approach this series. And it started from the idea that the tribe of Dan is missing from the book of Revelation. We know that there's 144,000 Israelites that were sealed, but then we see that the tribe of Dan is missing and also the tribe of Ephraim. But today we're going to be focusing on the Danites, especially in this series. So in order to do this justice as to try and attempt at figuring out why the tribe of Dan is missing, we got to go back to the book of Exodus. Specifically, the time frame right at the beginning of Exodus where we see in Scripture that there was a new king in town, a new Egyptian pharaoh, and he did not know who Joseph was. So when last we left, I'm talking about in regards to reading the Old Testament, if you're reading Genesis and you finish that book, you're going to see that Joseph himself was second in command to Pharaoh. There was nobody greater in his kingdom. And Joseph actually saved Egypt from starvation, obviously because of the hand of God as well. But to the people there, they had no doubt in their mind that God was favoring Joseph and that Joseph saved them so much that his own flesh and blood showed up in Egypt and didn't even know who he was until he revealed himself to them and wept openly, much to the confusion of the Egyptians. They're probably wondering why is Joseph weeping in front of shepherds, these detestable people? But then they found out he was their brothers. And Pharaoh himself said, look, you can have that land Goshen, and if you find anyone that's talented, Pharaoh's probably thinking in the back of his head, Joseph is gifted, saves a nation. I'm sure his brothers are at least half as good as him. So if you know of any of your brothers that are gifted at sheep herding, let me know and I'll put them in charge of my sheep and different things. So it's kind of surprising in some ways as to why this new king didn't know about Joseph, but at the same time, it would make sense that he wouldn't know who Joseph is after 400 years because one, Joseph is a Hebrew. So if you are in that culture of Egyptian history, you're not going to be spending a lot of time on learning about the Hebrews. You're just not, unless you are the sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. And we know that Joseph was alive until he was able to put his grandson on his knees, even his great-grandson, which is kind of cool. So I wonder what kind of stories would be around the campfires of Goshen after Joseph passes away. What do you think each one of the tribes would say when their children say or ask the question, how did we get here? Because our kids do that to us today. How did we get here? Why are we here? What is our purpose? But imagine being the 12 tribes of Israel in Goshen where things are going pretty good, and then it gets to a point where you're now a slave, in bondage, in debt to this nation, and they're not letting you go, you're going to have to explain that to your kids. I think it would be easier to explain in some ways from the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh, which are Joseph's kids, than it would be from the tribe of Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Issachar. I think they would have a tough time. Why? Because they were the ones that betrayed Joseph. So what kind of stories do you think they have? It would be stories of betrayal. And what kind of stories would Joseph's sons have? Hero stories. Like our father, our grandfather, our great grandfather, he was a hero to this nation. He saved Egypt. And if you run these stories for 400 years, you're going to get some people that are going to be a little bit bitter, just a little bit bitter. And now you see Moses, that was basically adopted by the Egyptians, by the Pharaoh's daughter, and he's educated, second to none. Now you get him coming out after 40 years. Now he decides to show up when he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating on an Israelite, and Moses shows up and grabs the guy and kills him, kills the Egyptian, and buries him in the sand, much like Cain did, buries him in the sand. And then the next day, Moses shows up to a picnic party and sees two Israelites fighting, and he says, "Hey, you guys shouldn't be fighting." And one of the Israelites, which I believe was the guy that he helped the day before, said to Moses, "Who made you judge? You going to kill me like you did the Egyptian yesterday?" That's when Moses realized, "Oh, I'm not like you people. I've grown up on the streets of Egypt in with the most sophisticated educational systems on the planet, and now you guys are basically saying that I am not the guy that I thought I was. I thought I was your savior. I thought I was your protector, but you're telling me you're going to kill me just like you did the day before? Who made you judge?" And then Moses realized the gig was up, and so he fled to Midian, stayed there for 40 years. And then when God shows up in a fire, Moses is curious and goes up to the fire, wondering why it's not burning up. And God said, "Take off your shoes. You're standing on holy ground." And Moses asks him, "Who are you? And why am I here?" And all this stuff. And God says to him, "I need you to go back to Egypt to tell my people, to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. I've seen their hardships." Then Moses asked God, saying, "If I go back there, they're going to ask me the question, 'Who are you? Who sent you?'" And God said, "I am that I am has sent you. Say that to them." And then Moses said, "I am not good at speech." And if you think that he meant that he had a stuttering problem, then I think you're going off in a different direction. Because again, Moses was highly educated. He may not have been very good at Hebrew at this time because, again, remember, he was under the influence of Pharaoh's daughter, being highly educated in Egyptian, may not have been so fluent in Hebrew. Then God said, "What about your brother? He speaks well," meaning Aaron spoke fluent Hebrew. So together, both of them would be like a good 1-2 punch. Because if you think about it, if Moses shows up to the Israelites and he can't speak very good Hebrew, they're not going to take him serious. But if you have Aaron speaking on his behalf, it begins to make sense. And we see Moses having no problem talking to Pharaoh himself. So then he convinces Pharaoh to let his people go, to let God's people go through plagues. And these are not just your everyday, hey, we have a flood today, or hey, we have a drought. This is utter destruction on Egypt itself, to the point where the Egyptians would come up to Pharaoh and say, do you not realize that our nation is being destroyed? Are you too stubborn to see this? And then finally Pharaoh lets everyone go, and then changes his mind one more time, and then it costs all of Egypt. And when I say all of Egypt, I'm not talking about just in that region of Egypt where we can look at any map and go, oh, this is Egypt. Don't forget, Egypt also had ports throughout the Mediterranean where they were harvesting tin and copper. Why? So they could make bronze. And they were very good at making bronze because tin wasn't from that region. Tin was more in Europe and as far as Britain. So they would have ports that went all the way up there related to Egypt. And we know historically, about the time frame of 14 to 1300 BC, there were environmental catastrophic events that happened in Egypt that is unexplainable to the secular mind. They have no idea why the Bronze Age collapsed. They have no idea. They're shocked. They're like, we don't know what there was. It looks like there was plagues, fire, drought, insects, all kinds of stuff going on, and they just stopped writing. They stopped building pyramids. They just stopped mining copper and tin. Just, we don't know why. This is historians saying this. Well, I could safely tell you that it was because Israel exploited Egypt on their way out the door. We see this in Exodus, that Israel had so much favor after the 10 plagues that they basically pushed the Israelites out the door saying, here, take our silver, take our gold, take our earrings, take all our jewelry, and go. We know God's with you. Maybe perhaps intercede for us so that he doesn't completely destroy us. And don't forget, every firstborn male, including animals, were wiped out in Egypt. This is the time frame, or this is the atmosphere of where Israel leaves, and they go out into Mount Sinai, and I think it took them altogether about 12 days to get to the border of Canaan, where they, if they played their cards right, they could have went in within a month. They could have went in to the promised land, and God would have reigned with them forever and ever and ever. But because of the hardness, because they were stiff-necked, they told Moses, you speak to God on our behalf, because the sight is terrible at Mount Sinai. And don't forget, when you get to Mount Sinai, there are literally 20,000 plus chariots of angels, chariots on fire with angels. You can almost picture them like the Secret Service for the President of the United States. God has a Secret Service, which are angels dispatched to guard the mountain so that nobody can touch it. Otherwise, they'd be run through with darts. While God was writing out the 10 Commandments with his very own fingers. And it was a horrible sight, a terrible sight to the Israelites, so much that they said to Moses, you talk to God for us. We can't do this. We're going to die and all this stuff. So then Moses goes to God. God says, they ain't wrong, Moses. They're not wrong. So then Moses has all these laws, teaches it to them. And then they say, you know what would be a good idea is if we were to send 12 spies out into the promised land so we can describe everything and bring back a good report. They bring back a report and we know the story. 10 spies bring back a bad report, including the tribe of Dan, saying these guys are giants. They're too big for us. They're going to eat us and they're going to eat our children. And God says, I'm going to flip this on your head because you said that these giants are going to eat your children. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow you to drop like flies in the desert because of unbelief. And your kids are going to enter into the promised land. So this is all going on around 1300 BC. Same time frame as the Bronze Age collapse. Same time frame. So now we have a little bit of an idea of the environment the Israelites are in. I want to focus in a little bit more as to why the tribe of Dan became tougher than nails. Why did these guys become warriors? What was going on? Well, if you look at how the tribes of the camps are divvied up, you can get a little bit of insight. You can get a little bit of insight as to what's going on. So if you look at it, the tribes are all divvied up. So on the east side of the tabernacle, you get Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. These are Leah's sons. And then on the south side, you get Reuben and Simeon, who are Leah's sons. And then you have Gad, which is Zilpah's son. Zilpah is a handmaid of Leah. And on the west side, something interesting is happening. So again, on the east side, you have Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, all Leah's sons. On the west side, you have Rachel's sons, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And then on the north, you have Dan, Naphtali, which are Bilhah's sons. And then you have Asher, which are Zilpah's sons. The reason why this is significant is because you have the Levites also surrounding the tabernacle in positions. And if you start at the very bottom of the tabernacle, you have the Kohathites. They don't get any wagons. And this comes up later because we get the rebellion of Korah where they are ticked that Moses and Aaron get all the credit. And here they are just carrying the ark, just carrying the lampstand and the altar on their shoulders. And they wanted to take over the tabernacle of Moses. They wanted to take over his priesthood. And maybe we'll talk about that in another video. But the Kohathites had no wagons. And then you have the priests, which we know they're Moses, Aaron, and then his 4 sons were on the east side of the tabernacle. And then the Gershonites had 2 wagons, which were on the west side of the tabernacle, and they're responsible for carrying the curtains, veils, and coverings. And then you have on the north side the Merarites. They're in charge of carrying things like the heavy framework, like the boards, the bars, the pillars, the bases, all that kind of stuff. They got 4 wagons to do that, and 8 Israelites are going to drive those 4 wagons. But the reason why I mentioned kind of the geography of the tabernacle, if you will, where they are camped out, is on the north side with these 4 wagons, you have the tribe of Dan, Naphtali, and Asher, and their job is to actually bear some of the burden as well, as in they're also the rear guard, meaning the tribe of Judah, their camp goes first, then the southern camp, which is Reuben's camp, then Benjamin's camp, then, or Ephraim's camp, then the northern camp, which is run by Dan. They go last. Why? Because if anybody were to do a sneak attack on the Israelites, Dan would be the first ones to confront them. because that's where they're usually an army or a nation is usually the weakest, especially when it comes to marching, is usually on the flanks or at the back. So Dan was responsible to take the brunt of an attack from behind. And you'll see this later when we get to the book of Judges, where they have this reputation for being the way that they actually protect themselves is they put their women and children ahead of them and they take up the rear. And we see that when Micah approaches the 600 men and they turn around and they're like, "What are you crying about here?" And Micah's like, "What do you mean, what am I crying about? You stole my idols, engravings and images. You took them all. You took everything I had." And the response by the 600 Danites were, "Keep your tongue still. Otherwise, not only will we kill you, but we'll also kill all your family as well." That's the mindset. That's the toughness of these Danites. These guys are tough as nails. Why? Because they had to be responsible for transporting the tabernacle from one camp to another via wagons, helping perhaps with some of the loading and unloading of the wagons. And I think they were also responsible for repairing a lot of this stuff, like the pillars, the pins, in case they get damaged, they would have to go out and make new pins, hammer them out. And don't forget, on the west side, we also have curtain, veils, and coverings. And we know that Dan, through the time frame of going through the wilderness, they become experts at engraving, making tents, making bars, chiseling, carving out nails, all kinds of stuff. Like, these guys are experts. This is their MO, if you will. This is what they're good at. They're good at engravings. And we'll see this later when we start tapping into what Vikings look like. We'll see some similarities between the Danites and the Vikings. But for now, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea or an atmosphere of what was going on in the time frame of the Israelites leaving Egypt and why they actually participated in the cause of the Great Bronze Age collapse. So if you enjoyed this, make sure and subscribe to this channel. Make sure and comment. Click on that notification bell. And the next time I upload a video, you'll be notified. I'll see you in the next video.